All right, in our last video together in 1302, we had looked at the Vietnam War and the end of the Vietnam War and the president responsible for getting us out of the Vietnam War is Richard Nixon. And now we're going to take a look at what Nixon is probably most infamous for, if not most famous for. He's definitely most infamous for the Watergate scandal. While it's not the worst crime to ever happen in the White House, it's the biggest and most shocking in terms of the scope of the scandal. By the time this thing is over, we're going to see the resignation of a president for the first time in American history. We're going to see a pattern of presidential abuse of power. We're going to see 7 members of Nixon's administration going to prison. A couple of his top aides, his chief of staff, former White House counsel, the former Attorney General of the United States, all going to jail. And we're going to see kind of this modern skepticism. This is kind of the creation of this modern skepticism, this idea that we have today, unfortunately, that we're used to our government lying to us. We're okay, not okay with, but we're at least not crazily surprised by the government not being forthcoming and truthful to us. That kind of starts with Watergate, right? That kind of modern skepticism. The whole thing is really about the presidential election of 1792. This is Nixon's re-election, and he wanted to win, and he wanted to win big. Now, he was probably going to win anyway, but he wanted to win by a landslide. So this is the election of like 1972. So to pull this off, to get this landslide victory, he was going to use an enormous amount of money. He was going to ride on his popularity. He was extremely popular going into this because of his foreign policy achievements. It talks about limiting nuclear hostilities, his trip to the Soviet Union, his trip to China. So there was a lot of popularity going into this. His only real kind of hiccup is the Vietnam War was still going on in 1972, and he promised that if he won election, he would end the Vietnam War. The other thing that he had going for him is the guy he was running against is a man named George McGovern. And for a couple of reasons, McGovern was kind of a bad candidate for this period of time. He was too liberal at a time when America had a very anti-liberal backlash. He wasn't as charismatic as previous Democratic candidates, like Kennedy, for example. So he wasn't the best of candidates to go against Nixon. So he wanted this landslide, and he got it. When it comes to the election results, it's pretty favorable for Nixon. Popular vote, he got over 60% compared to McGovern, got 37.5%. But it's really the electoral map where you can see the landslide victory. Nixon got 520 electoral votes. McGovern got 17, one of the largest landslide victories in American history. So he got what he wanted. But about 5 months before the election, on June 17th, 1972, 5 men were arrested for breaking into the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate building. It didn't take long for police to figure out that these burglars were not necessarily amateurs. For one thing, many of them actually worked for the CIA. They were using state-of-the-art equipment. They were bugging phones and tapping phone wires. Also, they weren't stealing anything, right? They're not burglars. It's not clear that they stole anything once they broke in. All of them, as it turns out, worked for, which I find hilarious, what they call this, is the Committee to Re-elect, or the Committee to the Re-election of the President, known as CREEP. So all of them worked for the committee that was to re-elect President Nixon. So the Watergate break-in, police arrest the crew. They arrest 5. I think there's 7 involved in all. And all of them worked for the CIA, or most of them worked for the CIA. all of them worked for creep. But at this point, there's no proof that Nixon is involved. And it's not even real clear what they were doing in the Watergate building in the first place. So there's no proof the president wanted them to break in. For all they knew, these guys just for a fun kick on the middle of the night, let's just break into this building and put some recording equipment. There's no clear evidence that the president is involved. However, it's suspicious, right? Many people found all of these coincidences a little too suspicious. And so men started to investigate this burglary more deeply. One of the men, and the Watergate scandal is a 2-year process. So even with all of this evidence that I'm going to explain through the course of these videos, it still takes 2 years for all of this stuff to unfold. But one of the men that is responsible for this case going forward is the judge that have the arrest of these men. Judge John Sirica is the trial judge of these burglars, and he is just convinced that there's got to be more to the story than these guys just woke up one day and said, hey, let's break into the Democratic National Headquarters. Also, one of the... Sorry, hang on. One of the burglars, a guy named James McCord, is going to be the one that really opens this whole thing up for everybody. James McCord, one of the burglars, is at first keeping his mouth shut. But as time goes on, he grows to believe that the higher-ups are going to pretty much let him fry for this. And McCord's like, this wasn't my idea. I did not really want to break in. I'm doing this on orders of somebody else, right? But when the trial started, McCord began worrying that he and his co-defendants were going to get hung out to dry. And the people who gave the burglars their order were going to pretend that the burglars were completely acting on their own accord, which of course they weren't. That Nixon's re-election campaign had nothing at all to do with the break-in. And McCord was not prepared to let that happen. With Sirica's help, he turned state evidence and agreed to testify with everything that he knew, both to the jury and to the Senate Investigator Committee, which is headed by Senator Sam Ervin. And with McCord's testimony, what they find really is the break-in on June 17th is really just the tip of the iceberg of what had been going on in the Nixon campaign that year. In addition to the official Justice Department investigation and the Senate investigation, 2 reporters from the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, started their own investigation. And these gentlemen began looking at the money trail. How was this thing funded? So Woodward and Bernstein started this thing when it was just a little minor burglary case, but they refused to give up. And one of the things that they helped establish was that the Watergate break-in was financed by some of the highest members of Nixon's staff. Also, through the investigation, they learned that in addition to breaking into the Watergate building, the campaign was involved in all kinds of little dirty tricks. Some of it was just kind of more like campaign pranks. For example, they would cancel election hall bookings. They would use fake IDs to go and work for the enemy's campaign. They would steal information. They would sabotage information. They would steal letterhead from the Democratic's campaign director. This is obviously a time before digital media, and so this is legitimate fake news. They're faking letters with like misspelled words and with racial slurs and things like that. And McGovern at the time complained that this was happening, but everyone just kind of, man, you're going to lose. You're being a sore loser. Most people at the time ignored him. Now, in addition to these pranks, they found something a little more serious. They found that the committee to re-elect the president had a continuing reservoir of secret cash to help finance their operations. This is a quote from the Post. So this is something that Woodward and Bernstein uncovered. Quote, "The FBI's investigation of the Watergate established that virtually all of the acts against the Democrats were financed by a secret, fluctuating $350,000 to $700,000 campaign fund that was controlled by the former Attorney General John N. Mitchell, while he headed the Justice Department. Later, when he served as President Nixon's campaign manager, Mitchell shared control of the fund with others. The money was kept in a safe in the office of the president's chief fundraiser and former Secretary of Commerce, Maurice Stans. And even worse, after the break-in, the slush fund would pay cash to the Watergate burglars to buy their silence, and to do all kinds of other illegal activities. Another thing that the Watergate scandal is going to kind of unfrail is going to look at Nixon's dark side. Nixon had a bit of a dark side on him. And there's a couple of things I mean by that. But one is that he took politics very personally. In Nixon's mind, there was no room for an honorable disagreement. He thought that everybody who wasn't with him was out to get him. And sometimes he was right, but most of the time he viewed everything as persecution. He thought that he was right, and anyone who disagreed with him was doing it for personal reasons or because they hated him personally. Everyone picked on him unfairly. Everyone was out to get him just because they didn't like him. There wasn't any other motivation behind it other than these people were his enemies, and his enemies needed to be crushed. You put that with paranoia. Oh, by the way, a good example of this taking everything personally is what we talked about in the Vietnam video with, I lost it, with the Pentagon Papers. Sorry, the Pentagon Papers did not talk about Nixon per se. They don't mention him at all, but because they're about the administration, because they're about the government, and he's in charge of the government, he took the Pentagon Papers very, very personally. All right, second, the Watergate investigation revealed that Nixon was paranoid. He thought that he had a lot of enemies, and his other problem was he thought he had a lot of enemies. He was an utterly paranoid man. Throughout his political career, he was convinced that all kinds of people were conspiring against him. Third, he believed that he could use the federal government and all of its agencies as he saw fit. He treated the federal agencies like they were his own private servants. And it was pretty clear from his enemies list and his philosophies that he could use any measure of the government he could to bring that power to bear on his political enemies. The FBI, the IRS, the Justice Department, the CIA, these were all available to him, in his point of view, to go after his political enemies. Oh, that's what I was talking about, the Pentagon Papers. So you can see, right, all of this comes out in the Pentagon Papers. He does use the force of the government to go after Ellsberg, the author of the Pentagon Papers. He sees it as a personal attack for him, on himself personally. He sees the Pentagon Papers as an enemy. Ellsberg is an enemy, and an enemy has to be crushed. So this is kind of the person of Richard Nixon. And again, none of this was known really about him going into that election. Going into the election, he was very, very popular. So all of this dark side comes out as a result of the Watergate investigation and the more and more stuff they find. And we will talk more about what he finds and what is further uncovered in the Watergate scandal in the next video.